Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Nuggets News. Today, welcome back a special guest for his fourth appearance, I think, on Nuggets News. That's Kain from Synthetix. There's just so much happening in the world of DeFi at the moment. Yield farming has taken off in the past 48, 72 hours. So I really wanted to get Kain on and talk what is yield farming, what do we need to know, what are the risks, the big opportunities, because we're hearing about these huge yields. People want to know how to do it, is it safe? And Kain, you're really across everything. So thanks for coming on again.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a pretty exciting time. There's lots of interesting stuff going on. So excited to have a chat
Not
about
only
it.
that, but Synthetix have had a few big updates in the past 24 hours, including options, which is one of my big passions. So we'll dive into that later as well. But I guess in a nutshell, I really think that we need to rename DeFi open finance, because it's really just about opening it up, isn't it, to everyone? The idea of having a bank account or being able to get yield, because a lot of banks have negative interest rates or zero these days. So any just thoughts on the brief overview about the ecosystem and what's come to the mainstream in the past few months, but it's something that you guys have been working on for years.
Yeah, I guess there's this kind of undercurrent of like open finance versus DeFi. I'm definitely in the DeFi camp. I mean, it is the same thing, right? It's just different names for things. But I think it's important that we highlight the fact that it is decentralized, even if decentralization is a spectrum. Where we're kind of pushing. I think there's a lot of fintech platforms that are sort of open in the sense that they're accessible, but maybe still centralized, very centralized. So, things like Nexo and things like that, you could argue they're open finance and anyone can kind of access them. They're not walled gardens, but they're not decentralized. They're still run by a company. So, I think DeFi is kind of trying to push past that a little bit, and some of the governance aspects and other things are part of that
Yeah,
process.
that's probably the first thing for people at home to understand as well. It's definitely a spectrum. So we've heard about whether they're called DeFi or not. We have a lot of these places where you can lend your tokens and earn yield, and some of them range from being just a centralized company that's lending them out to other centralized companies, all the way through to the purely smart contract platforms where the developers or the founders don't even have the keys anymore to do anything to your funds if you wanted to. It's all just software. And Kain's been really open and honest about the fact that projects like Synthetix and many others, they are more centralized to begin with, because you need someone, a team or an idea to start somewhere, and then you gradually sort of give more to the community and give them more governance through the token. And we've seen a lot of projects change their tokenomics lately as well, haven't we? Staking or governance. So do you want to maybe talk about that spectrum, where you guys fit on it, and how some of these projects, I think including Synthetix, have tried to become more decentralized?
Yeah, for sure. And, it is a kind of multi-dimensional thing, right? It's not a linear spectrum, in kind of one dimension. And I think that when you look at governance, for example, right, there's a whole bunch of different ways you can govern a protocol. You can have a centralized entity that's governing it. You can have something that is run by a DAO, where it might be 5 or 10 or 15 members that are controlling all of the voting power within
And
that
just for
DAO.
people at home, a DAO is decentralized autonomous organization. So we're just giving the power to all the token holders to decide things rather than a board of a company. So sorry to say that, but I know whenever people say words
That's
like
okay.
DAO, we've got the beginners and they're like, "What's that?" So yeah.
Yeah. So you have some DAOs which are very even though they're kind of decentralized in the sense that there's no entity that's governing it, right? There's a group of people that are making decisions on behalf of all of the token holders or all the participants in the network. And then you have things like Synthetix, where you've got sort of social consensus, which moves the protocol forward. So we have this governance process where people can propose a change to the protocol. It goes through our community, and then eventually the community decides whether or not to implement it. And then there's a protocol DAO, which is controlled by 7 people, and those 7 people then take that and implement it. But part of this process is kind of handing control slowly, over to the token holders. And so one of the things we're working on, which will be coming out, soon in the next few months, is allowing token holders to actually veto a change if the protocol DAO gets it wrong, for example. So, if the social consensus says we're going to do this and the protocol DAO goes and tries to do something else, then token holders will actually be able to come in and override them and say, no, you can't do this. We're gonna block.
So in your example, the protocol DAO, so who's making the decisions there? If that's separate to the SNX like DAO holders that can then veto that decision, what's that two-step process? Like, how would it be different? Yeah.
So it's like layers of governance, right? So, you kind of made the analogy to like a board, right? So the protocol DAO is like a board. There's 7 members, and you need 4 of them to make a decision. But then behind them, you've got token holders who can collectively get together and say, actually, we don't like the decision that group of people made, the members of the DAO made, and we're going to block it. And that ultimately gives back a lot of control to the token holders and provides a level of sort of comfort and security that the protocol DAO, even though it has a fair amount of power, can't go rogue and go and do something that's against the interests of the wider
Fantastic.
community.
So could you maybe give us an example, and I know you've had plenty of these recently, where you have implemented a change, and for people at home, you might have heard of BIPs, like Bitcoin improvement proposals, or Ethereum improvement proposals, and I know you guys, do you call them SIPs? Have you had...
SIPs or SIPs. Cool. Yeah, exactly.
And some of those that you've had recently, I think one that I read about, which I just love, was adding Ethereum as collateral as well on SNX, because that just opens up the market cap of what synthetic assets people can now create and trade.
Yeah, correct. And so, we've got proposals like that to add Ether as collateral. But then even within that proposal, there are sort of configurable variables that need to be set, right? And so a recent example is we just launched liquidations. So now there's a liquidation mechanism that's built in. And within that liquidation mechanism, there's 4 or 5 variables that need to be set. And one of the variables that was set by the protocol DAO was to allow a 2-week window where there's essentially a delay before an account can be liquidated. And the community said, actually, we don't like that. It's too long. We want to compress that to 3 days. And one of the community members wrote up a fairly detailed analysis and did some modeling around, what the impacts of going from 2 weeks to 3 days would be. And last night on our governance call, which is why I'm a little bit tired, because we drew the short stick in the Australia time zone, and we're up till about 2 a.m. last night on our governance call. So it was a bit of a late night, but on the governance call, we discussed whether or not we should make this change. And it looks like that change will actually go forward, and the community wants to do it to bring it down from 2 weeks to 3 days. So that's a good example of the community stepping in and saying, someone taking up the kind of banner and saying, I'm going to do an analysis of this and make a recommendation, and the rest of the community kind of rallying around that.
People are used to seeing bags under the eyes on this channel with a baby Kain. So with the liquidations, I know we had the Black Thursday a few weeks ago when everything got liquidated, and Maker had a huge issue because they were trying to liquidate positions, and the loans and the Ethereum chain was full. So people, hopefully our audience, are kind of familiar with all that. How would that work in that instance? And is that a little bit different to, like, your process there of waiting 2 weeks or 3 days? Are you liquidating people from being able to act in the ecosystem altogether, or is it individual positions, or what's that process you're describing?
Yeah, so it's individual positions, but we have a much higher buffer, a collateral buffer, right? So the ratio that we maintain is 750% versus Maker, where it's 150% is the threshold. So there's a lot more kind of leeway to allow prices to kind of compress before liquidations kick in. And so at the moment, the threshold is set with a fairly high buffer, so we don't need to be as aggressive about kind of liquidating people immediately. But again, the community, and particularly one member of the community, said, well, actually 2 weeks is too long. Let's bring it down to 3 days, and it may even be compressed further. And there's just a set of trade-offs around how short should it be versus how much risk is there for price manipulation and various other trade-offs. So constant dialogue.
And I know one thing we've spoken about in previous episodes, and I guess in general, people are always saying, why do people want to trade or have to over collateralize to that huge degree? But I think when it was Synthetix token only that's backing all this, it's going to be inherently volatile. I mean, we've seen ETH drop over 90%, so these other tokens need to have a big buffer. But now that is starting to mature, and you're talking about adding Ethereum and the different metrics and how that will work, but where I think this is going going long term that I really want people to understand is, well, firstly, we're going to have under collateralized loans once people start to build reputation and trust, but we're also going to tokenize everything. So I'll be able to have, for instance, tokenize my house and have that as collateral, and that will integrate into the DeFi world. And I'm never going to risk the whole value of my house, but if it's worth a few $100,000, I might want to have a little percentage of that to do some trading and put on some gold positions or some options. So you can start to see how that over collateralization can work in different instances and where this is all going in the future. And I know you guys are going to integrate all this sort of stuff. I'm sure it's on your roadmap, and you must have so many ideas with everything that's happening in the DeFi world at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, it's super exciting. I think one of the big things that's kind of shifted that we didn't sort of talk about in the prep for this discussion, but with the two Bitcoin logos sitting behind your head there, makes me kind of think of it, is the launch of our synthetic Bitcoin pool in partnership with Ren. So Ren BTC as well as Wrap BTC, and that's using Curve, which is one of the AMM, so auto market maker liquidity pools. That pool is now up to a little over $9 million worth of tokenized or synthetic Bitcoin, which is pretty incredible when you think about it. So there's now tens of millions of dollars worth of Bitcoin that's on Ethereum, and I think it's a huge trend in DeFi that, for people who have been around for a while, like, yourself, you have some Bitcoin and it's probably sitting idle. If we're honest, it's probably sitting in cold storage or maybe on some exchanges or various other places, but it's unlikely that it's doing much for you right now. And so the ability for people to tokenize their Bitcoin, and I've been doing this pretty aggressively over the last few weeks as Ren has kind of gotten a little bit of traction, and bringing Bitcoin onto Ethereum, the ability to do that and convert it into, say, wrapped Bitcoin, put it into Compound, and we can start talking about some of the yield farming things a little bit later. But I think it's one of the biggest trends right now in crypto is this tokenization and migration of Bitcoin onto Ethereum, and I think it's going to be huge.
Yeah, so there's probably three things that I really want to dig into and talk about next. Initially, we saw Tether, which was on Omni, which was a layer on top of Bitcoin, and then we saw that migrate over to ETH, and that was the better chain to send Tether over. Now we've seen a range of stablecoins all blossom on Ethereum. So you've got the centralized versions. Again, we've got this spectrum of USDC, which is fully regulated, to Tether, which is a bit murky, to DAI, and the Synthetix version of USD, so sUSD, these more decentralized versions. Now that's blown up 1,000% year over year in terms of, I think it was $1 billion to 11 billion yesterday. It's probably 12 now, but that's all growing really fast, and that's really important for the DeFi ecosystem. But then you've got this next step, which is wrapping up Bitcoin and turning Bitcoin into an ERC20 token to have as collateral and all these smart contracts. And I think further on, this gets into the ultimate conversation about, is Ether money, is Bitcoin money? Everyone's obsessed with US dollars as the world reserve currency at the moment. But now, is Bitcoin and Ether going to replace that further on down the line? So this is where all these conversations we're having are sort of heading, aren't they? But let's talk about the ERC20, the wrapped Bitcoin coming onto Ethereum. So we've got Ren BTC, which is the Ren protocol people have heard of. We've got wrapped BTC, which is a more centralized version. Now we've got sBTC, so Synthetix BTC. So again, do you want to maybe talk us through the spectrum, how each of them work, from the more centralized to the decentralized ones?
Yeah, so synthetic Bitcoin, so sBTC, which is issued by the Synthetix protocol, is purely a synthetic representation of Bitcoin. So there's no Bitcoin that's locked up as collateral against it. It is just a synthetic asset that tracks the price feed that comes in. So it doesn't have a hard peg to Bitcoin, but it does have some other cool properties like the ability to convert it from, say, synthetic USD to synthetic Bitcoin to synthetic Ether, etc. So within the Synthetix ecosystem, sBTC is quite powerful. But for people who potentially have Bitcoin that is currently sitting on an exchange or sitting in cold storage and want to tokenize it and bring it into the Ethereum ecosystem, for the average person, right, who doesn't have access to wrapped BTC, which requires BitGo as a custodian, and you need the KYC, and you need to have a little bit a little bit more kind of access, I guess, in terms of like institutional account access and things like that. You can now turn up to the Ren bridge and send your Bitcoin to an address, and it will be tokenized as Ren BTC on Ethereum, and then you can convert it from there into stablecoins or ETH or anything you want. And this has only really been in the last like 4 to 6 weeks, right? That all this stuff has kind of emerged. Wrapped Bitcoin's been around for a while, but it has been a sort of permission system, which is closer to something like Tether or USDC, where the Bitcoin's held by a custodian and then it's tokenized, and that token can be redeemed, but only by certain market participants. So you or I can't turn up and just convert Wrapped Bitcoin back into Bitcoin. You need an institutional account. Whereas Ren BTC, anyone who's got Ren BTC can turn up to the Ren bridge, convert it back to BTC, or vice versa. So it's much more permissionless, trustless, and open, which is obviously.
Is there
exciting.
another one, TBTC?
TBTC, yeah. So TBTC is another implementation with slightly different security approach, and it launched, and then there was a bit of an issue that was found right after the launch. So they kind of launched a soft launch of a beta, and then that was shut down after a couple of days. But my understanding is that it will be relaunching fairly soon, and once that relaunch happens, then you'll have 2 kind of permissionless gateways to get Bitcoin onto Ethereum, which is obviously even better. The more options you have, the better.
And who are the teams behind the TBTC? Is that a separate?
Keep. Keep is the team behind it. Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
That's where I was getting my wires crossed a little bit. So the Wrapped Bitcoin is a fairly centralized version where you've got to sign up to a platform, you've got a KYC. I think Kyber helps out on the distributing of the ERC20 token once you've given your Bitcoin to BitGo, which are like a custodial platform. That's cool. That's what I want people at home to understand. Then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got Ren. So the Ren protocol, it's decentralized, a DeFi kind of ish protocol. That's where you can actually wrap your Bitcoin yourself. Then Synthetix is just a synthetic version. So you don't actually, or you can't do it with Bitcoin, you do it with your ETH and your synthetic assets.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. So there's no actual Bitcoin backing it yet. Although Bitcoin collateral in the form of maybe Ren BTC or TBTC might be something that we launch in the future to allow you to take your own Bitcoin, tokenize it, put it into Synthetix, and then actually mint SUSD and other synthetic assets against that Bitcoin. So some really cool stuff that we can do once we've got permissionless Bitcoin on Ethereum.
Fantastic. So let's maybe dive in a step further and talk about all these different stablecoins, because this is where we get into the lending. There's big demand. Everyone wants these stablecoins for different use cases, particularly trading at the moment, but lending. And then we have the liquidity pools. And I think this is where people get confused, and even I was trying to get my head around what Curve Finance in particular do. So now we've got these different stable coins. Do you know, maybe we just spoke about that spectrum, but how is all this working, and how has it changed with some of these pools, like what you guys are doing at the moment to earn interest?
Yeah, so I think necessity is the mother of invention in terms of yield farming. And so if you go back to I think June or July of 2019, Synthetix had a problem. We had this really cool nascent ecosystem of synthetic assets that could be converted between each other, but we had really very little liquidity going in and out of that ecosystem. So it was really hard to get your ETH or other ERC20s into synthetic US dollars or synthetic Bitcoin or synthetic Ether. And so, we looked at some of the options, and obviously Uniswap had launched in late 2018 and was starting to get a little bit of traction. And we kind of looked at that and said, okay, what if we could put synthetic Ether and Ether into Uniswap and incentivize people to provide liquidity there, right? And there's some nuances around which assets you choose and why, and some of the risks around it, which we can get into. But the intent was, we want a really liquid on-ramp for people who are holding Ether to be able to get into the Synthetix ecosystem. So we started paying SNX tokens as a liquidity incentive for people who were essentially staking this pool and putting assets into it. And at one point, in 2019, I think we got up to about 45 million or something like that worth of Ether and synthetic Ether that were in this Uniswap pool. And this is again before Curve, before Balancer, before a lot of the new liquidity pools had kind of arisen. But that was the intent, and that kind of started. That was the genesis, I guess, of this liquidity mining or yield farming.
And for people at home, Uniswap is a DEX, so somewhere where you can go to swap one asset for another. So Uniswap. But the way it works is giving people incentive to add liquidity. So just like an exchange, we have market makers. If you have some tokens laying around and you're happy to contribute that at the current price, then when people come in and trade, you get paid a percent of what? So in your instance, you said you paid people SNX tokens, but if I launch Nugget Coin versus Ethereum as a pair, how does that work, and how do I get to choose what I pay those people?
So essentially, a Uniswap-style AMM is trying to take idle assets, right, that might be sitting in a wallet doing not very much, and turn them into a market-making asset, turn them into liquidity. And so if you were sitting on some KNC, some Kyber, and some ETH, and you were just kind of holding it, you could actually put that Kyber, that KNC, and ETH into a Uniswap pool and become a market maker, essentially, and let people trade against you. And as that trading happened, you would get fees from the trading. When we launched the sETH ETH pool, there wasn't a lot of demand for people to be going in and out of this pool, as you can imagine, right? Because it was still very new ecosystem that we were building. So what we said is the fees alone are not going to be sufficient to bootstrap this network effect and get a bunch of people to put ETH and synthetic ETH into this pool. So what we did is we said, if you do it, not only will you get the fees, which will be low, but we'll actually pay you SNX on top of it, which will be much higher. And the yield for that, at times was 50, 60, 70% APY, right? So people all of a sudden who were sitting on a bunch of ETH said, this is a kind of a good place to put my ETH. I'm holding ETH anyway. I'm long ETH. I'm happy to do it. And so that's why the pool really ramped up from a few $100,000 to 40 million plus over the course of 6 months.
And
or so.
It's definitely those network effects, isn't it? I'm trying to think of the term where the number of connections and it just grows exponentially. And we definitely hit that point now, and we're starting to talk numbers in the billions of dollars in terms of DeFi. But now I'm hoping if people are sort of followed along, you can start to see, well, hold on, people say, hey, I can get 50, 60% annual yield if I contribute some ETH into this Synthetix pool where they need liquidity for their project. And then you can say, well, I can actually borrow ETH from over at this other lending platform for only 1%. So this is where we start to get this sort of Lego, and people are saying, well, this is dangerous because you're building on top of one another. But maybe we'll get into the dangers, but this is how it happens. People say, well, I can borrow from here at this rate to get this rate over here. And then they start to earn these other tokens, and they say, well, I'm going to put those other tokens here as well. And you started building on top of each other.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if your listeners or readers follow money stuff on Bloomberg, but Matt Levine, who's the guy who writes it, makes this comment every once in a while saying, if I go to you and say, I'm going to pay you 20% APR, month on month, is that a scam, right? And the answer is always yes, right? Like it has to be, because you can't have a risk-free return of 20%. It just doesn't make sense, right? And so when you look at that and you say, okay, you're getting paid 70% APY, right? Why is that happening? And that's the question that everyone needs to ask themselves whenever they look at any kind of DeFi yield generating system. Where is this yield coming from? Why is the market so inefficient
Absolutely.
that money isn't kind of flooding in to kind of take this free energy and close the gap between that and a normal return?
Yeah, arbitrage,
right? And yeah, exactly. And in this case, there were multiple layers of risk, right? So the first layer of risk was the Synthetix system itself, right? So you were taking your ETH and you were putting it into a pool with synthetic ETH that was issued by the Synthetix ecosystem, right? So if something happened catastrophically to the Synthetix protocol and the sETH became worthless, your ETH was going to be gone, right? So that's your first risk, total catastrophic loss of everything, right? So that alone is a fairly big risk, right? And probably would be enough to, get the return up to maybe 20-25% a year, because, you're taking on that risk and you need a significant return to justify the risk, right? Then on top of that, you're being paid in a token that was fairly illiquid, right? Particularly at that time. And so if everyone had been trying to sell that token at the price, it would have pushed the price down, right? But not everyone did. Some people held on to it. So that's another risk that you're taking, is liquidity risk. And then the third risk, the third major risk, right? There's other risks, but the third major one was Uniswap could be hacked, right? There could have been a bug in the Uniswap protocol, and all of the Uniswap, pools could have been drained, right? Now it turned out that wasn't the case, and Uniswap has lasted a really long time, which is amazing, without any hacks or losses. But that was definitely a possibility as well, right? So, you had these multiple layers of risk, right? Which is how you ended up in a situation where the market said we need to be paid 70% per year to justify putting our assets into this.
So, I'm just trying to think it through in my head. There's not every step of that's actually insurable with, say, Nexus Mutual, even, because you've got things like liquidity risk. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah, and even smart contract risk. You can insure against smart contract risk, but it becomes harder when it's chained, right? So you can insure against the smart contract risk of Uniswap, for example. But if it wasn't Uniswap that failed, and remember, Nexus Mutual is a mutual, and there's human intervention involved in the payouts of some of these.
Some of our followers, they always say you're not allowed to say it's insurance. It's a mutual cover. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'm probably not so literal, but the result is that it was effectively impossible to cover all of those risks, right? So you couldn't insure against it, and even realistically, if you could insure against it, and this is another critical thing to kind of take into account when you're looking at market efficiency, if you can insure against that risk, the cost of the insurance should approach around about the cost of the risk, right? If the market's saying that we're going to be paid a 70% return to do this, then the cost of insurance should be somewhere in the ballpark of that 30, 40, 50%, right? It doesn't make sense that you could insure all of the risk and make that magically go away for 1% a year when people are only accepting 70% a year, because that would get off and that gap would be closed, right? So, again, when you look at DeFi, there's no such thing as free money. Any risk that you're taking, any yield that you're getting, there'll be hidden risks, and there'll be obvious risks and unknown risk and tail risk and risks all the way down, basically. So you need to come at it with eyes wide open.
And we have done a dedicated video called Best DeFi Platforms, and I explain the difference between scams and Ponzi schemes and DeFis and lending, and where those numbers come from as well. If people have got maybe, let's say, $100,000 as a crypto portfolio, I'd be having a play around with, maybe $1,000, like a 1%, or maybe up to 10% if you love this stuff and you are confident in taking out some cover, or what you're doing. But it's, again, never put in all your crypto into these things just because you hear about these big numbers, because of what Kain's just described. And I think we've seen some good tweet threads this week and some articles about all the risks, because there was it Sunday afternoon when I think everyone gets on Twitter and it's just like 100% yield farming, the memes start coming out, and beginners go, where do I get 100% year-on-year returns? And they just want to lock up all this ETH. So anything to add to that, Kain, in terms of the risks? I think you've kind of outlined the different types there, but there's a little one as well. Oh, are you on mute, mate?
Yeah, I just muted because she's. I think she might have just heard herself.
You're right.
So
I'll keep talking for a little bit while you're on mute.
Okay, cool.
But
all right, thanks.
And our viewers are very, very used to hearing Louis cry in the background as well. So we know these things happen on the channel. But the next thing I wanted to dive into was the different scaling solutions. So you guys have recently implemented, I think it's optimistic rollups, but I'll let you talk about all that. But I think just in the past couple of months, it's come from nowhere and surprised a lot of people. And Vitalik put out a tweet saying, while everyone was focused on the halving and whether or not we're in crypto winter, this, that, and the other, all of a sudden we've got Amisi Go come back from the dead. Hey guys, we've launched Plasma. We're going to put Tether on it. This is working. And people will go, oh, wow, okay. Then we've got Raiden, one that I really love. I think it's a bit underrated at the moment. They've got their state channels, their Lightning Network. And then you've got 3 or 4 other combinations of things that happened on the Ethereum main chain and layer 2 that have clearly scaled to thousands of transactions a second. So got Loopring Pay. What are some of the other ones here? Matter Labs, Validium is, I think, another one they had to rename because of the confusion on layer 1 and 2. But I'd just love to pick your brain on these different things that have all probably not come from nowhere in your mind because you've seen it all happen, but it's all live now all of a sudden.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible the proliferation of scaling solutions that have come out, and again, the issue obviously that we're seeing in Ethereum at the moment, where with Tether being on there and some of the Ponzi schemes that are pushing a lot of transactions. I'm looking at it now. Gas price is sitting at 40 Gwei right now, which is pretty painful. So if you're active in DeFi, you're burning a lot of ETH right now for gas, and so anything that we can do to scale is huge. And I think in the same way that when you have these unknown risks that exist, right, and you're fine until you're not, and then you have this huge blow up, right, which is why you don't put all your money into something where there are tail risks. The flip side of that is that you have some of these things that don't work at all and look like they're never going to work, right, and all of a sudden it just kind of clicks, and all of the you get this kind of critical mass that's hit, and then it all works, right? And so I think we've had little bits and pieces of scaling solutions that have been kind of popping up, and different papers and research that's been published for the last 3 or 4 years, and then all of a sudden from kind of late last year we just had project after project after project kind of finally nailing things, right? And so we've decided, because of some of the constraints that we have with Synthetix, to go with the Optimism team. So they have, I guess, a generalized solution in terms of hosting smart contracts on L2 versus just, say, payment channels or state channels where you're kind of transferring value. And so the OVM demo that we did now about a month ago, which was essentially a trading competition that was running on layer 2, was a really good example of the difference in terms of scalability that you can get out of a layer 2 solution, even for a complex smart contract like Synthetix, where we were having 200, 300, 400 millisecond confirmation times versus 2, 3, 4, 5 minute confirmation times or longer on mainnet right now. So and that was very much not optimized, but it was a kind of indication of where we want to go. So we're working really closely with the Optimism team over the next 3 to 6 months to kind of get onto mainnet. And the plan at the moment is to migrate the entirety of the smart contract suite, of which there's 200 plus contracts now on mainnet onto the OVM to allow everything, minting, burning, claiming, exchanges, all of it to happen on L2, and that'll significantly reduce gas usage, speed up trading frequency. So we'll be able to actually compete with centralized exchanges out there, like the Krakens and Binances and FTX and BitMEX of the world. So it's super exciting.
Just one thing I wanted to get into quickly for people at home to understand is what you said about Ethereum and gas, and people understand Bitcoin fees and Ethereum fees, but a contract actually has to use more gas or more computational power than just sending money from A to B. So some of the questions we recently got in our group were, I'm trying to claim my, say, Synthetix rewards or do a contract, and that's taking up even more gas than just when they maybe look at how much a transaction should cost. It's actually a different thing again. So maybe just give us the quick rundown of how that works.
Yeah, so when you look at a gas estimator, typically an ETH transaction takes 21,000 gas, right? So even at 40, 50 Gwei, it might be cents, right? 10 cents, 15 cents, whatever. When you are doing a transaction on, say, 1 inch, right, where there might be 20 or 30 different sub transactions, they actually deploy a smart contract to run through all those transactions atomically and then self-destruct that smart contract at the end. It could use 1.5 million gas, right? So you're talking, 2 orders of magnitude larger, right? So, someone who's used to maybe sending a bit of ETH around or an ERC20 and paying 10, 20 cents, all of a sudden they're presented with, $10 in fees to make an exchange, and it just means that the size of the transaction you need to do has to be much larger, right? You can't send $5 because you're paying $10 in gas, and so this is essentially, one of the challenges that we have in this environment of high gas, where, in the past it was 2-3 Gwei was high, and now, it's 40 Gwei. And so everything's much harder, which is in some ways good, because it forces people to really accelerate the adoption and transition down.
Yeah, it was fun. Back in the day, you could send Bitcoin with a 0 fee because the blocks weren't even full. So miners would incorporate your transaction just because they would get the mining reward. But I think some beginners are going to do these more complex transactions or just actions in general, and they're decreasing the gas because they see that it's going to cost $10 or $20, and they say, oh no, I'm going to pay 10 cents, and we get these messages to our support saying, hey, it's been pending for hours, and well, that's why. So that's something just to know, guys. Let's get into some of these more complex yield farming things at the moment, and what options do people have. So we touched on Uniswap, where you can just contribute liquidity. And I think we've got similar things where like Kyber want to upgrade and they want to have staking. And we've got 0x as well, and they're paying some tokens in fees. So what can you do? Maybe run us through an example on Synthetix to farm yield or get rewards. Compound is one that's been red hot at the moment. And then Curve Finance is the other one that I was asking you about.
Yeah, so the kind of straight up protocol liquidity incentives or yield incentives like Compound are, put assets into Compound and you get paid in comp tokens, right? Which is pretty straightforward, right? And on the risk spectrum, fairly low risk, right? Just providing assets into Compound is a fairly low risk way. It's not going to be super high yield. If you put some ETH into Compound, you're not going to make much money on it. If you put wrap Bitcoin or something like that, you might make a little bit more. So if you've got some idle Bitcoin, for example, taking it, this is a good exercise maybe for some of your OG, Bitcoin users who might not be, or listeners who might not be so familiar with Ethereum, take some of your Bitcoin, take, 0.1, 0.01 BTC or whatever you want, go through Ren Bridge, wrap it up, and then go to something like Curve, right, the AMM pool, and you can swap that into wrap Bitcoin, and then you can deposit that, $100 or $1,000 or whatever into Compound, and you'll start earning comp tokens just for your Bitcoin sitting in a different place. And it's in a smart contract. It's not sitting on an exchange wallet that could be hacked or drained or whatever. Obviously there's smart contract risk, but Compound's been holding 150 million plus worth of assets for almost 2 years now. So in terms of safety as smart contracts go, it's one of the safest ones out there. So that's a really good exercise in a very straightforward protocol.
And I think
and then you get
there's a new website, the Ren Bridge that you spoke about, the bridge to go from A to B. Was it ren.cafe or something like that? I'll put that link down below.
Yeah, I'll send you a couple of links at the end. So there's WBTC Cafe, which is a way of going from Ren essentially straight into WBTC. So that's a cool way to do it as well. So there's a number of different approaches of how you can kind of get your Bitcoin onto Ethereum now. But then, again, just taking it, sticking it into Compound and lending it out is a really good way to get some yield on the Bitcoin as well as get some comp tokens.
I was going to say, can you just describe the Curve Finance step that you said? So they've got liquidity pools where they're bringing together different flavors of wrapped Bitcoin to try and hedge the risk there. And I think we've spoken about like Pi DAOs on the channel before. We can make these pies to hedge the risk. Is that the same sort of concept, or how's that work there with Curve Finance?
There's a few different concepts there. So Curve is like a liquidity pool. So essentially you've got, say, synthetic Bitcoin. So you've got sBTC and you want to get to wrap BTC because you want to put it into Compound, right? So you've been trading on Synthetix. You're done trading on Synthetix. Now you just want to park your Bitcoin and earn some yield on it. So you can go to Curve. And the cool thing about Curve is the way that the liquidity curve is set up. You can trade $100,000, $200,000, $500,000 worth of Bitcoin with almost no slippage, which is really, really cool. So it's a way of getting large quantities and large volumes of Bitcoin back and forth between these different protocols. And the same thing works for stablecoins. So if you've got a bunch of USDT and you want to go into USDC, for example, you might have $200,000 with USDT and you want to go into USDC, you can go through Curve and have almost no slippage. Which is awesome. And you don't need to go to an OTC desk or anything like that. You can literally just go through a smart contract. So that's the advantage.
And how do they achieve that with no slippage?
It's basically very deep pools and the way that the curve is set up for the AMM curve, it's a flatter curve essentially, right? So there's most of the curve pools are set up such that they're assets that should trade at the same price. So stablecoin pools, for example, where there might be a little bit of variance, but not too much. And so essentially they have like an amplification coefficient. So, if there is a bit of slippage, arbors will come back in and arb it.
It's incentives. If I try to withdraw too much of one stablecoin, the reward yield will go right up.
You'll actually get some slippage, yeah. But at the moment, the main curve pool has $13+ million in it. So you could go and convert $1 million worth of USDT into USDC with 20 bips of slippage maybe.
Now, I'm just thinking longer term, and one conversation we had previously was about what Ripple is trying to do, and I think I threw out there that, well, we've got projects like Synthetix, we've got all these different flavors of stablecoins, and we've got DEXs, and it's very easy to trade one asset to another. Now where we're bringing these things together like Curve, where we're pegging different assets and their exchange rates, we've got deep liquidity pools, we've got less slippage, then we've got scaling with instant near free transactions with these different scaling solutions we've just touched on. Is this all coming together with the DeFi Lego world where I'll be able to send you euros for Aussie dollars with no slippage for instant free payments? Is that where all this is going?
100%. And at the risk of triggering some of your listeners, I think the reality is that the XRP value prop, if it ever existed, is dead. There's literally no value proposition in the market for XRP as a solution. The technology just is not viable in comparison to scaling solutions combined with Ethereum, combined with stablecoins. And the last mile, this is the kind of missing link that wasn't there, that just for the first time got connected, was regulated banks. And so there's a bank in Liechtenstein called Bank Frick that just began to accept USDC as a deposit mechanism. And that's the last mile, right? Because if you think about a bank is, this big organization with a database, right? The database says it has money, and who owns the money, right? And the fact that it exists within a sort of regulatory framework means that database actually is money and not made up bullshit or something like that, right? So if they connect their database, which they control, right, and it exists within their very fast internal systems, typically, right? It's the interbank communication that's very slow, right? Within a bank, it's just a database, right? It runs very quickly. So if you wire up Ethereum to this database and say the stuff on Ethereum is money, USDC is money, and the database is money, you've cut out all of the friction and all of the issues that we see in the kind of settlement rails. And then if you combine multi-currency stablecoins that can be converted with almost no slippage, at whatever the prevailing rate is at the time, you've solved the remittance problem. And so what we're really waiting for is this last mile to
the other day I saw another Aussie dollar stablecoin from a company I'd never even heard of, and they popped up and they're fully regulated. So every country, even Tether has Tether Euro. It's been around for years. It's just a matter of once we have the liquidity or the incentives and the curves, as we just spoke about, then it's here. You just need people to download the app and they can do it. So yeah.
And I think the big difference between, say, Euro Tether or even Tether USD is Bank Frick, or a regulated bank, in the EU, is not going to integrate Tether. That was just never going to happen, right? So you could have billions of dollars worth of Tether, you could have it running on crypto exchanges and billions of dollars worth of volume, but it was never going to be connected at the last mile. Whereas USDC, and I said this in the early days when these regulated stablecoins were coming out, that they could end up being a Trojan horse, and it's taken a lot longer than I had hoped, but it's kind of getting there. They could end up being this Trojan horse where regulated entities like banks integrate these regulated stablecoins. And once you've got a regulated stablecoin that can go in and you've got Curve, you can take your $1 million of USDT, convert it into USDC, and send it to Bank Frick, and it arrives in your account that day,
Oh.
which is
I mean,
pretty
this is
incredible.
you might have seen me tweeting or talking about this, the digital Thickshake theory. So in the world of macro, they've got this this US dollar milkshake theory where there's all the global reserve currency is US dollars and there's all this supply and demand for it around the world. All these different countries have US denominated debt, so they need dollars to pay down their debt and to issue loans to companies. So there's just huge demand for US dollars globally. As soon as we have DeFi, a smartphone, anyone can get into digital dollars or digital representations of dollars or ERC20 or different chains, stablecoins, and then you can go through the different currency stablecoins. You can swap them for no slippage. You can send them instantly and free. All this stuff is far, far superior to the banking system and our payment rails. And as you just said, it's that kind of Trojan horse thing, which is now accelerating it. And also, if you have these government-issued stablecoins or central bank-issued stablecoins, if there's any ramp or any market for them to go from A to B, as you said, then it's just boom, the ramps and all this money that's going to come flooding into crypto, and it ends up going that next final step into Ether, if Ether has good monetary policy, or Bitcoin as well, if you believe in the scarcity arguments. Just because there's trillions of these other things being printed, or there's something that you can't print more of, and all that value is going to flow into the thing that's scarce. It's just such an easy step, but it's taking years to play out.
Yeah, exactly. It's things always take longer than you expect, right? Whether it's scaling or whether it's kind of macro monetary evolutions, but things like the kind of COVID crisis have a tendency to accelerate them, and so I think we're seeing that acceleration happen now, and the next 12 to 18 months is going to be very, very interesting.
Now, Kain, in the early days, and one of the reasons I got right behind Synthetix, because I remember one of our very first conversations, I was saying, I'm not that bullish on just stable coins, and then you said, well, we're doing synthetic assets, and my mind started to race, and now you've launched options this week. You've got tokenized gold and silver already, all the different currencies. You've added some indexes and oil. So what else is on the horizon? Talk us through the options and maybe talk us through some ways that people can earn some rewards as well.
Yeah, so there's I think 6 different active rewards, and probably the most important one for your followers might be the synthetic gold liquidity incentive. So we've got it ends this week, so there's not much time to get into it, but if you can get in before Friday, you can earn some SNX by providing liquidity into this synthetic gold pool on Uniswap v2, which just launched. So that's a pretty cool incentive. And then as you mentioned, binary options will be launching next week on Tuesday. Next Tuesday it goes live. So that's going to be really interesting, and it's the first time that there'll be the ability to have SNX markets on the Synthetix platform, which is going to be interesting to see what the community sort of does and responds to there. But yeah, lots of cool stuff coming, and then futures in a few months, and various other things to kind of get the exchange up to where we want it to be. So it's a very, very exciting time for Synthetix.
Yeah, and I think just wrapping up, the place where I've always just seeing that this is going and I'm just so passionate about is once you guys have those indexes and futures and options, and it's going to be way lower fees than any of these other platforms. It's going to be trading or accessible, I guess 24/7 is probably the right word, and we are really just starting to eat the traditional financial world's lunch, and we're cutting out all the middlemen and we're making it open and cheaper for everyone.
Yeah, it's as I said, it's super exciting. So the kind of proliferation of options for people to put their money to work in DeFi at the moment is crazy. It's really hard to keep track of. So you kind of got to just jump in and start playing around with things. Put a little bit of money in, not too much, and just kind of test it out and see where it leads you.
Well, Kain, you've ended with a dad joke there. I don't think you meant to there, saying the options that we've got on Synthetix, but that's very, very fitting with the the little one in there as well. But that's been great. I will timestamp all the parts, and I really hope this video becomes a resource for everyone, because it is complicated, I know, and hopefully we've explained everything today in easy to understand terms. But I'll put the links to everything we spoke about down below as well. We'll have to catch up with Kain again in future, but I guess keep up the good work. And any final messages for people?
No, that's it. Always a pleasure, Alex. So yeah, hopefully your listeners and followers get something out of it, and I'll send you a couple of links to some of the different things we talked about as well, to make sure that you can kind of give them a bit of a reading list afterwards.
Okay, thanks so much, Kain. I hope you guys enjoyed that one. Cheers.